you. First, I want to thank Wuxinbo for inviting me, and I want to thank Fudan University and the Korean sponsors as well. Now, the title of my talk might seem a little bit odd, but that's because the original title of this panel was that it was sent to me when I thought about the title of the talk was actually a little bit different. It was Asia's Disputes, New Approaches, or something like that. New approaches, new ideas, something like that. And that provoked me to think whether or not newer would actually be a better idea than relying on some better ideas we can think of that may not necessarily be new. So bear with me. What I'm going to do is offer what's, I think, more analytical than prescriptive. In other words, more of a diagnosis of maybe what lies behind some of the disputes in Asia, and how thinking about them a little more clearly might help those who are most interested in resolving these disputes discover a way to deal with them more usefully. And this idea that maybe there's not a need for a fundamentally new or absolutely new approach to dispute resolution really is a simple observation, reflects a simple observation, which is that it's possible that there are some new wrinkles on dispute resolution that we might see applied to dealing with some of East Asia's problems and disagreements. But they won't be fundamentally new. I mean, they'll be maybe distinctive in some ways, but they're likely to draw on approaches that have been used elsewhere historically. And moreover, I think the idea that you have to wait until you can discover some absolutely new, brilliant idea for resolving disputes runs the risk of making, as we say in English sometimes, making the best the enemy of the good. That there may be perfectly good approaches that can be relied upon that maybe the states in East Asia have been reluctant to embrace. In other words, maybe there's a need for some fresh thinking about old ideas rather than a fruitless, perhaps, search for brand new, different approaches. So what I want to do in the short time I have, and I've been trying to cut things out of my remarks so I stay within the time limit, but I will heed the warning I received from Professor Wu when he gives it to me. I want to talk about the different types of disputes that states face in the region. I want to talk about the various approaches that they can take for dealing with these disputes, and then think about some of the possible results of dispute resolution one can imagine. First of all, types of disputes that we have in mind and people have talked about in various ways today. I think it's pretty clear that when you think about the region, there are a lot of different kinds of disputes. So maybe it's not surprising that they persist, that they've been difficult to solve. But these disputes really reflect a variety of types of disagreements. Some of them reflect disputes that are historical in nature, who did what to whom and why. Especially in Northeast Asia, we're all familiar with disputes about the role that Japan played in the 20th century. But you also have these historical legacies in South Asia, firing disputes between India and Pakistan. We have disputes that reflect legal disagreements about treaties and customary law, disagreements about what states committed themselves to in signing certain agreements, whether certain agreements were binding just because they might have been named declarations, things like the Cairo and Potsdam declarations, interpretations of international peace treaties like the San Francisco Peace Treaty, different understandings of the international law of the sea as represented in UNCLOS. So there are legal disagreements. There are also economic disagreements, especially a reflection of the growing globalization and interdependence people have talked about, because along with that, there are going to be winners and losers from cross-border trade and investment. There's going to be disagreements about the rules governing investment and trade regimes, currency values, intellectual property rights. So you have that feeding into some new disputes in the region. And of course, you have sovereignty disputes, where states claim exclusive right to control territory and waters near what they believe is their national territory, and especially disputes over land borders, island claims, the delineation of maritime claims, defined in part by other claims to land at sea, where countries disagree about what are territorial waters, what constitute their exclusive economic zones, what makes for the international waters or high seas. So that's just one way of thinking about the different types of disputes and what may lay behind them. The second thing I want to talk about are alternative approaches to trying to resolve disputes in the region. And there's really a much larger menu or toolkit of approaches than I think people have thought clearly about. And part of this requires a more liberated thinking rather than ossified or calcified, or whatever the right word would be, old thinking in the sense of being stubborn and inflexible. Because I think there are approaches to some disputes in the region that could work quite well if the principals, the parties to these disputes, would free their minds to consider some options. One way of thinking about approaches to disputes is thinking about, well, exactly who should the parties be that are involved? Should the approach to dispute resolution be unilateral, bilateral, or multilateral? And each of these may have a role to play. When people think, they rarely think of it this way, but you can have a unilateral approach to resolving disputes. Usually one thinks about this in a strong state imposing a solution on a weak state through the use of military force. But one could also imagine dispute resolution that's unilateral in nature, where a strong state, secure and believing it can be a bit generous, makes concessions to the other party that aren't really made as an exchange in some sort of a bargaining situation. I think this kind of unilateral concession might be worth thinking about in the region. It might be a wise move for states that recognize that the issue they may have a dispute with another state over is really not worth the cost of pushing as hard as they've been pushing to get their way. And that unilaterally conceding to the smaller or weaker party at sometimes could have benefits for the stronger state. So unilateral approaches might be one way to go. There are also bilateral approaches. The virtue of a bilateral approach to dispute resolution is simplicity, of course. It avoids complex trade-offs among multiple actors. There are drawbacks to a bilateral approach, however. The drawbacks are that some disputes by nature involve more than two parties, so you can't really have a bilateral resolution. But another drawback is if the parties in the dispute are very unevenly matched in terms of their capabilities, whether it's military or economic power, it may make a bilateral negotiation simply seem unfair to the weaker party. The strong state may very much want a bilateral approach because it sees advantages, but the weaker state may see the negotiation that's bilateral as not really much of a negotiation at all, really as constituting a diplomatic approach that's tantamount to bullying or the strong exploiting the weak. Certainly China has experience with this as the weaker party historically. We all know about the so-called unequal treaties, some signed as a result of wars, but some imposed on China when it was weak by stronger powers. There are some in the region, especially ASEAN states, and in particular the Philippines, that seem to think that it's unable to really negotiate with China on an equal footing, and it's not clear that a bilateral approach to resolving China-Philippine disputes is viable. So bilateral approaches. Multilateral approaches have some virtues or advantages. It has the virtue of providing parties, to bring parties into a negotiation perhaps, that can look at the issue a bit more objectively than the principal disputants or the principal parties in the dispute. A party to a multilateral negotiating session could serve the role as an honest broker between the countries that really have the dispute that you're talking about. Moreover, a multilateral approach to dispute resolution also can have the virtue of gaining a broader consensus to support a resolution if it's achieved, and that can facilitate enforcement of whatever resolution was agreed upon. Of course, multilateral approaches have their downside, and the main drawback is complexity. More parties have to sign off on the resolution that is sought. You also have the risk that in a multilateral setting, one of the parties might feel as though it's being isolated and others are ganging up on it. You run the risk that in establishing a multilateral dispute resolution mechanism, that you have another dispute layered on the original dispute, which is a dispute about which parties ought to be part of the multilateral grouping that is going to discuss the issue. And of course, we've seen some of this in the context of the Southeast Asian disputes in which China is involved, and whether they should be handled multilaterally, and whether the United States should in fact play any role or have anything to say about the disputes in that part of the world. Another way of thinking about differing approaches to dispute resolution is not to focus on the number of parties involved in dispute resolution, but to think a bit about the domain in which dispute resolution goes on. Should dispute resolution be managed within the context of international organizations, which already exist, either regional ones, as people have mentioned today, or genuinely global ones? You have the international organizations like the UN and various UN-related groups. Regionally, you have ASEAN, the East Asia Summit, et cetera. The good news is you have institutions. They exist already as a venue for sitting down and talking about disputes. The disadvantage is that many of these international organizations or regional organizations I mentioned are reluctant to really tackle the kinds of disputes we've been thinking about today, because the organization has its own interest in avoiding having its reputation undermined because it's unable to achieve progress in dispute resolution, or that it fears that failure of the process of dispute resolution could in fact undermine general support for the institution. Since I only have 2 minutes, let me just tick off some of the other domains in which dispute resolution could be pursued, but may or may not be. For a variety of reasons we can deal with in the Q&A if people want. International legal settings. Appeals to international law may be a useful way for dispute resolution, but it's limited by the willingness of the parties to, in fact, undertake that approach. The military domain actually offers an opportunity for dispute resolution, and I don't just mean the use of force to resolve the dispute. Confidence building measures, negotiations about transparency, as Mr. Barsky mentioned this morning, I believe, and also talks about arms control agreements are all ways in which the military domain can in fact help facilitate dispute resolution. The last set of points I was going to make, though I'm running out of time, was to think a bit about what should you expect dispute resolution or approaches or efforts at dispute resolution to achieve. And I think you have to think about this as a spectrum. I can imagine 4 different sort of statuses of dispute resolution. One is the one everybody hopes for, which is a comprehensive resolution of the dispute, whether it's a treaty or something like that, settles it once and for all. You can secondly think of interim resolution, where the dispute is somehow put on hold temporarily. Think of ceasefires. Think of the idea of proposing joint exploration or exploitation of economic resources while some other parts of the dispute are set aside. That's the second kind of resolution, not quite as good as comprehensive. Third is what you might call benign neglect, which is somewhat satisfying. In any case, it might be the de facto choice. And this is where the parties simply agree to disagree for reasons that both accept. Maybe they believe that the problems that they have elsewhere in the region are more important, so they're not going to focus on their dispute at the moment. Or maybe it's because the parties have a longer-term vision and are willing to set aside the dispute for now. The fourth and the least happy outcome in dispute resolution is what I would call malign neglect. It's the least satisfying. The parties simply don't address the dispute because they won't or they can't even agree on a framework for dispute resolution. They disagree about the venue for discussions. They disagree about the importance of addressing the dispute, or they disagree about whether there is even a dispute at all, as we've seen with Japan and China over the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands. The consequences here are simple, and I'm going to wrap up by saying the consequences are that what may be needed in East Asia is not so much a discovery of some unheard of approach to dispute resolution, but to analyze disputes and think about which existing tools in our toolkit of dispute resolution are best suited for the variety of different disputes that exist. I'm done. Don't worry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.